The river city had learned to speak in numbers long before it learned to pray quietly. By the late 14th century, its stone quays were stackable bales and grain sacks, its counting houses dense with the smell of ink wax and damp parchment. Barges moved through the water like slow thoughts, carrying credit as often as cargo. It was here, in this environment of contracts and collateral, that the House of Valkyrie first appeared to step outside the normal arithmetic of fortune. Before that moment, the Valkyrie were unremarkable, minor landholders with a few warehouses, a marriage or two into respectable guild families, nothing that suggested inevitability. Their name appears sporadically in tax rolls, usually misspelled, sometimes crossed out and rewritten. Then, abruptly, the record sharpens. Their accounts stabilize. Their loans mature early. Debtors who should have defaulted instead arrive with payment in full, often ahead of schedule, sometimes claiming confusion about why they had ever owed money at all. The first document that marks the change survives only by accident. It is a notarial register from the winter of 1392, its pages warped by water and fire, recovered centuries later from a collapsed civic archive. Most entries follow a rigid pattern: date, name, sums, seals. One entry does not. It is written at the bottom of a page already full, squeezed into the margin as though added later. The hour is noted, which was uncommon. The witnesses are listed as present but unnamed, and instead of an inked signature, there is a smear of darkened wax impressed with a signet no other record can identify. From that night forward, the Valkyrie accounts begin to behave strangely. Debts cancel themselves through chains of transactions too complex to reconstruct. Rival banks fail in clusters, their ledgers balance yet their vaults empty. Ships bearing the Valkyrie crest return intact from voyages that destroy others, sails whole, crews intact, cargo dry. Storm records from the same weeks describe violent seas that somehow leave certain vessels untouched, as if weather itself recognized a boundary. At first, the city responds as it always does to success, with imitation and praise. Guilds petition the Valkyrie for partnerships. Churches accept their tithes, though priests privately remark on how exact those offerings are, down to the last coin, arriving neither early nor late. There's admiration, but also the faint irritation that comes when someone prospers without sharing the method. Whispers circulate, then fade. In a city built on quiet advantages, silence is not suspicious by itself. The first unease enters the record through absence. A junior notary named Luca Ferrin disappears in the spring of 1394. He is young, diligent, recently assigned to audit several Valkyrie instruments as part of routine review. His name appears in the register on a Monday. By Thursday, it does not appear anywhere at all. No burial entry, no court record. His room remains locked, his shoes by the door. The city assumes flight or illness and moves on. Weeks later, a marginal note appears in one of the Valkyrie ledgers, written in Ferrin's hand. The ink matches his other work. The phrasing does not. It references an obligation now satisfied according to the earlier form, a phrase that appears nowhere else in the archive. The note is dated after Ferrin's disappearance and filed without comment, as though its placement were unremarkable. When later clerks try to annotate it, their additions fade within days, leaving the original line untouched. By this point, the reaction shifts. Guild leaders request copies of Valkyrie contracts and are refused politely, then firmly. A Dominican prior delivers a sermon on usury and order, never naming the family, yet all listeners understand the target. The Valkyrie attend as usual, heads bowed, expressions calm. Their donations continue. Nothing overt breaks the surface, but a pattern begins to repeat. Scrutiny approaches, then stalls, then dissolves. Escalation does not arrive as a single event. It accumulates through repetition. A warehouse clerk reports that candles in the Valkyrie counting house burn with short blue flames that give no warmth. An apprentice claims he heard pages turning after midnight when no one was present. These accounts are dismissed, but they recur, always attached to the same location, the same rooms where contracts are stored. Inspectors note nothing wrong, yet none of them return for second visits. The ledger itself becomes an object of attention. It is thick, its spine cracked, its pages repaired with careful stitching. Some entries are written in scripts older than the city, languages clerks cannot identify yet instinctively skip over. When one scribe attempts to copy a page, his replica emerges subtly altered, figures aligned differently, sums adjusted by a single unit. When compared, the original remains authoritative, the copy erroneous, regardless of arithmetic. At this stage, the authorities intervene. An audit is ordered, formally and publicly, under the seal of the apostolic camera. Rome requests clarification, not accusation. The request is precise, its language restrained. The Valkyrie acknowledge receipt and prepare their documents. Messengers carry the paper south along established routes, yet the first packet arrives incomplete. The second arrives intact but unsealed. The third never arrives at all. What returns instead is silence. Weeks pass. The city continues its trade. The Valkyrie continue to prosper. But the audit does not advance, and no explanation is given. In a later Roman register, a brief notation appears beside the Valkyrie name. Examined, concluded. No findings are attached. No recommendations follow. The lasting mark of this period is not found in correspondence, but in space. The counting house on the riverfront develops a reputation that persists long after the counts are closed. Those who enter describe a pressure in the chest, a sense of standing before something that does not require acknowledgement. Candles still burn cold there, according to inventories taken decades apart. The building remains intact through fires that level neighboring blocks. By the time the Valkyrie name fades from prominence, absorbed through marriages and inheritances, the city has learned to treat certain questions as settled. Contracts can be binding beyond lifetimes. Seals can outlast names. And somewhere beyond the visible exchange of coin and labor, terms can be agreed that do not expire. When later historians trace similar patterns north and east, they do not begin with theology or rumor. They begin with ledgers, baptismal rolls, and absences that repeat with unsettling precision. The river city closes its books, but the ink has already traveled, seeping into other archives, waiting to be read in a different place, under a different name. The trail does not vanish when the Valkyrie records fall silent. It bends instead, following the movement of clerks, marriages, and capital northward, crossing borders that change names more often than their habits. By the early 17th century, the pattern reappears in Bohemia, embedded not in merchant ledgers but in parish books kept with meticulous care. The setting is inland now, colder, marked by forests and fortified towns still bearing scars from war's religion. Here, survival itself has become a form of currency, and the House of Karski holds more of it than anyone can explain. The Karski estates sit untouched while neighboring lands change hands through confiscation and execution. Their banners remain raised through invasions that strip other noble houses to foundations. At first, this endurance is attributed to prudence and luck. The Karski pay the correct loyalties at the correct times. They marry cautiously. They avoid public controversy. In a century where families vanish for less, this restraint appears admirable. The destabilizing detail emerges from a baptismal roll dated 1628. The parish priest, whose hand is consistent across decades, records the birth of a firstborn son to the Karski line. The entry is clean, the sponsors notable. 10 years later, when the same priest records the birth of another child to the same parents, the first son is no longer referenced anywhere. There is no burial entry, no marriage record, no notation of illness or travel. It is as if the child had aged out of the archive entirely. At first, this absence is treated as clerical oversight. Then it happens again and again. Across generations, the pattern repeats with unnerving regularity. Firstborn sons appear, are baptized, sometimes even confirmed, and then vanish in the record before adulthood. In their place, adopted heirs arrive from distant cousins or minor branches, always properly documented, always accepted without dispute. The line continues without interruption, yet the true heirs never reach inheritance age. The anomaly remains contained within paper for some time. The villages surrounding Karski lands notice something else. While famine cycles empty granaries and thin populations elsewhere, Karski fields produce consistent harvests. Grain prices drop locally, then stabilize. Laborers are paid on time. During harsh winters, Karski storehouses open selectively, enough to prevent unrest, but not enough to invite scrutiny. Gratitude mixes with fear. The family becomes necessary. Human reaction follows predictable lines. Servants gossip first, then fall silent. Certain corridors in the main residence are avoided after dusk, not because of sightings, but because of a pressure described only as weight. Doors close on their own. Cradles stored in attics are never reused. When asked, the household steward insists these are old superstitions, nothing more. Escalation enters through administration. An imperial census officer, tasked with reconciling population figures after the 30 Years' War, notes a discrepancy on the Karski lands. There are more graves and deaths recorded over the last 50 years. The excess is small but persistent, appearing in every parish connected to the family. When questioned, local priests defer to earlier volumes that cannot be produced. Some claim the pages were lost to fire. Others say they were removed for copying and never returned. The evidence prop that anchors this period is a bundle of letters preserved in the diocesan archive in Prague. They are written by one parish priest to successive authorities, each letter carefully phrased, never accusatory. He asks for guidance on missing records, on the absence of heirs, on repeated requests from a Karski household to amend dates retroactively. Each reply arrives already opened, the seal broken, margins marked with faint thumbprints. None of the responses address his questions directly. Instead, they instruct him to continue his duties and avoid speculation. As years pass, the priest's handwriting tightens. His final letter ends mid-sentence. There is no record of his reassignment or death. A different hand continues the parish books the following year, and the anomalies persist without comment. The wider community adapts. The Karski name becomes associated with continuity rather than lineage. People speak of the house as something that endures beyond individuals. Tombstones in the family crypt reinforce this perception. They bear the same recurring symbol carved beneath each name, an empty cradle, unadorned, repeated without explanation. No dates accompany the carving. It does not correspond to any known child. Authorities eventually take notice at a higher level. Imperial auditors are dispatched to reconcile noble titles after a particularly violent confiscation elsewhere. Their preliminary notes mention the Karski succession as unusual but compliant. Before the audit concludes, the team is recalled. The order comes from above their chain of command and signed. Their notes remain unfinished, filed under a classification that prevents further inquiry. What remains after this intervention is a silence heavier than before. Servants who once avoided certain wings now refuse to enter the residence at all after sunset. Adoption records become more frequent, their origins more distant. The family tree grows sideways rather than upward, branching around missing trunks. The lasting mark of the Karski case is not a single disaster, but a sustained absence. No scandal breaks. No trial convenes. Instead, the family persists intact while the concept of inheritance erodes within it. Bloodlines continue without blood. Names survive without bodies. When later scholars compare these records to earlier Italian accounts, the resemblance is unmistakable. Different geographies, different instruments, the same quiet subtraction. Somewhere between baptism and adulthood, an obligation is being met. The archives do not say how, only that the costs are consistent and the beneficiary unchanged. By the time imperial attention shifts westward toward maritime wealth and colonial routes, the Karski estates remain standing, their crypts sealed, their cradles empty. The pattern has proven portable. It does not require rivers or trade. It adapts to forests and fields, waiting for the next environment where silence can be exchanged for stability, and where the absence of heirs is treated as an acceptable price. By the time the pattern reaches the Atlantic, it has learned how to travel without being seen. The coast of western France in the early 18th century is loud with industry, its harbors crowded with masts, its taverns thick with salt and rumor. Trade now moves faster than records can follow, and wealth arrives in quantities that make careful accounting feel almost old-fashioned. It is here, among tides and schedules and insurance tables, that the House of Morcant perfects a different form of payment. The Morcant name appears first in port registries rather than parish books. Their ships are listed as punctual to the day, sometimes the hour, even when weather reports describe conditions that should have delayed them by weeks. Captains change frequently, but routes remain fixed. Cargo manifests are complete, loss is minimal. Insurers initially reward this consistency, lowering premiums, citing exemplary management. Within a decade, Morkan vessels dominate certain lanes, their reliability reshaping entire supply chains. The destabilizing event that forces attention is minor by comparison. In the spring of 1724, the brig St. Avellini docks at dawn after a routine crossing. The crew disembarks without incident. They walk under their own power. They answer when spoken to, but only with nods and gestures. Not a single man speaks. Physicians are called. Tongues are inspected. Throats examined. No injury is found. Within days, the men are returned to their homes, where they resume work silently, as if speech had simply become unnecessary. At first, this is treated as an isolated illness. Then it happens again, and again. Morkan ships arrive with holds full and crews intact, yet increasingly quiet. Sailors communicate with signs improvised on the docks. Families adapt. Wives learn to read expressions. Children grow up without hearing their fathers' voices. The anomaly spreads only along Morkan routes. Neighboring fleets report no such cases. Social reaction is pragmatic. The ports depend on market reliability. Merchants accept silence in exchange for profit. Tavern owners note the absence of song and conversation, but continue serving. Clergy attempt blessings, then stop when the men attend services without responding. No sermons are altered. No formal complaints are filed. Escalation enters through paperwork. Insurance syndicates begin to refuse Morkan cargo without explanation, citing non-standard risk. Legal challenges follow, initiated by competitors who cannot match Morkan efficiency. Courts convene, evidence is presented, and cases stall. Judges recuse themselves. Clerks misfile documents. One advocate is found drowned in a shallow canal. The ruling listed as accidental. The cases are dismissed quietly. A coastal ordinance banning night sailings is issued after a particularly violent storm. The Morkan fleet ignores it. Their ships depart and return as scheduled, unmolested by weather or patrols. No fines are levied. Harbor masters note the violations and receive no response. The evidence prop from this period is an Admiralty logbook, later recovered from a private estate sale. Several pages have been removed and reinserted upside down, their bindings reversed. The entries describe Morkan voyages in neutral terms, but marginal notes in a different hand mark certain departures, with a single symbol repeated across decades. The symbol does not correspond to any known maritime notation. The haunting residue of the Morkan case is sound, or rather its absence. Harbors at dawn ring their bells as usual, marking arrivals. The bells echo across the water, unanswered by shouts or greetings. Dock workers learn to unload in near silence. The sea itself seems to absorb voices along those piers. The pattern shifts when Morkan heirs begin to die. There are no witnesses, no signs of struggle. Young men collapse in offices or aboard ships, found hours later as of asleep. Autopsies reveal nothing conclusive. Death certificates cite fatigue, fever, weakness of the heart. Within a single generation, the direct line thins to nothing. The company persists under trustees, then dissolves. Its routes are absorbed by others who cannot replicate its precision. The silent sailors age, retire, and are buried. Their gravestones bear no epitaphs, only names and dates. When archivists later align Morkan records with those from Italy and Bohemia, the pattern sharpens once more. Here, the payment is not blood at birth or disappearance in youth, but voice, a resource extracted gradually, normalized, and only noticed when it accumulates. As the sea closes over Morkan hulls and the ports move on, a different authority has already begun to notice the repetition. Inland, within stone buildings that catalog both sin and exception, documents are being compared for first time. The question is no longer whether these families prospered unnaturally, but whether anyone still remembers the terms. By the time the pattern draws the attention of the church, it has already learned how to survive scrutiny. Southern Spain in the early 18th century presents itself as a land of order restored after centuries of fracture. Cathedrals rise white against the sun. Archives swell with correspondence meant to prove that everything has been counted, corrected, redeemed. It is within this architecture's certainty that the House of Alvarado becomes impossible to ignore. The Alvarado estates sit inland, surrounded by land that should have failed long ago. Drought cycles pass over the region with predictable cruelty, yet Alvarado fields remain green, their wells unexhausted, their granaries full enough to sell surplus at controlled prices. The family attends Mass publicly, donates generously, and maintains close relationships with ecclesiastical officials. On paper, they are exemplary. In practice, they are anomalous. The destabilizing event does not begin with the family, but with the church itself. An internal memorandum circulates among a restricted group of clerics, never read aloud, never copied in full. It acknowledges, in careful language, a convergence of irregular cases across Europe. Noble houses displaying sustained prosperity paired with unexplained absences, failed investigations, and archival inconsistencies. The document does not name causes. It names patterns. The Alvarado are listed among several others, their file marked complete yet unresolved. The anomaly grows bolder here. Exorcisms performed on Alvarado lands fail in ways that are difficult to record. Relics brought from nearby monasteries darken when placed near certain storehouses, their surfaces clouding as if handled by many hands at once. Clergy report resistance not of violence but of inertia, a refusal of phenomena to respond. Prayers conclude. Rituals end. Nothing changes. Human reaction fractures along familiar lines. Villagers accuse quietly, then publicly, then fall silent when nothing comes of it. Some local officials accept Alvarado patronage openly, arguing that stability benefits everyone. Others distance themselves, requesting transfers or resigning without explanation. Within the church, disagreement sharpens into camps. Those who insist intervention is necessary, and those who argue that continued prosperity must reflect divine favor, regardless of discomfort. Escalation follows through authority. An inquisitorial court is convened in Seville to examine the Alvarado case, among others. Witnesses are summoned. Testimony is taken. Depositions are sealed. Then, without announcement, the court dissolves. Its records are transferred to a different archive under a classification that removes them from circulation. The presiding officials are reassigned. No verdict is issued. The evidence prop that survives this intervention is a single vellum decree, recovered centuries later from a misfiled bundle. Its edges are scorched, not burned through, as if exposed briefly to intense heat. It bears multiple seals, some overlapping, some impressed twice. The text contradicts itself in places, authorizing investigation and forbidding it in the same paragraph. Marginal notes reference a final clause shared across cases, without elaboration. The haunting residue left on Alvarado lands is architectural. Chapels built on estates are abandoned within a generation, not due to collapse, but avoidance. Bells hang intact yet ring once each year, on no fixed feast day, according to parish calendars that cannot be reconciled. No ringer is ever recorded. Villagers hear the sound and close their doors. What remains after the church's intervention is a recognition, never stated aloud, that the usual instruments no longer apply. The Alvarado continue. Their harvest persists. Their line thins but does not break. Clergy records grow cautious, descriptive rather than interpretive. The memorandum circulates one last time with an addition, a date written in a different hand, centuries in the future. It is this date that later scholars will notice when comparing seal files. Not an expiration, but a maturity, a point at which obligations cease to be abstract and become immediate. As Spain turns its attention outward again, toward reform and empire, the Alvarado case is archived under doctrine rather than heresy. The implication is subtle but decisive. Whatever binds these families is no longer considered a spiritual deviation to be corrected, but a condition to be managed until it resolves itself. The final resolution does not arrive through prayer or judgment. It waits instead for an era that believes itself immune to such arrangements, an era confident enough to reopen old ledgers without fear. When that confidence finally arrives, the church's seal date begins to matter, and the silence that once protected these names becomes a liability rather than a shield. When the last files are reopened, the world that receives them believes itself protected by distance and reason. The era is modern enough to trust classification systems, legal finality, and the assumption that unfinished matters eventually dissolve. Archives have become instruments of closure rather than warning. It is within this confidence that the final convergence occurs, not announced by disaster at first, but by alignment. The trigger is academic, almost trivial. A regional historian, tasked with consolidating scattered estate records for a digitization project, notices that several unrelated noble families appear to have vanished within the same decade. Their names differ, their geographies do not overlap, yet the timing is exact. Properties liquidated, trust dissolved, lines ending without dispute. The historian flags a coincidence, expecting an explanation rooted in economics or war. Instead, the deeper she looks, the more the gaps resemble one another. Fragments surface from different centuries and languages: an Italian ledger margin, a Bohemian parish absence, a French admiralty symbol, a Spanish ecclesiastical date. When overlaid, their measurements align. Margins match margins. Gaps correspond. What had once been isolated anomalies now behave like parts of a single document distributed across time. The anomaly escalates as this reconstruction accelerates. Descendant families who believe their ancestral lines extinct begin to experience abrupt reversals. Fortunes evaporate through legal mechanisms no one can contest. Accounts are frozen by institutions that cannot identify the authority issuing the orders. Properties burn without accelerant, fires consuming only specific wings, sparing others with surgical precision. Investigators find no cause. Insurance claims are denied on technicalities that reference clause is no longer in use. Public reaction moves in stages. First scandal, then disbelief, then a deliberate narrowing of attention. Media coverage fades as lawsuits stall. Files are sealed under privacy provisions invoked without request. The events are not denied, they are rendered unsearchable. The language shifts from explanation to containment. Escalation reaches its peak when legal heirs attempt restitution. They file claims, demand arbitration, request to confront whatever entity now holds authority over their assets. No opposing party appears. No representative answers. Proceedings conclude anyway, judgments issued against absence. The law behaves as if the counterparty were present, satisfied, complete. The evidence prop that anchors this final stage is the reconstructed ledger itself. Assembled from fragments across centuries, it exists now as a single artifact. Its margins align perfectly when bound. Its clauses reference one another across pages that were never meant to be read together. At the bottom, where signatures should be, there is space left blank. No name was ever required there. What remains afterward is not chaos, but erasure. Estates revert to wilderness. Titles lapse. Family names persist only in footnotes. The institutions that once benefited from these houses quietly adjust their histories, removing references that no longer serve a purpose. The silence that once protected prosperity now conceals collapse. The haunting residue of the ledger's closure is spatial. Former centers of power stand empty, reclaimed by weather and growth. Archives retain shadows where documents were removed so completely that even their catalog entries disappear. Researchers describe a sensation of having finished something that did not want to be finished, of having closed a book that continues to press against its cover from the inside. The final realization arrives without ceremony. The debt recorded across these cases was never financial, nor even generational in the simple sense. It was structural, a concession that allowed certain families to step outside entropy for a time, accumulating advantage by delaying a cost that could not be eliminated, only postponed. When maturity arrived, it did not negotiate. It executed terms already agreed. Other ledgers remain scattered. Other margins wait to be aligned. The pattern does not end with disclosure. It simply becomes harder to see. In a world that trusts archives to tell the truth, the most dangerous documents are those that appear complete, because they teach us to stop looking. The record does not conclude with the closure of the ledger. That belief belongs to archivists, not to the material they handle. What follows the final entries is not annotation but drift, a slow redistribution of what was taken and what was left behind. Institutions that absorb the abandoned assets adjust their balances and move forward. Cities repurpose estates whose ownership no longer resolves to a living claimant. The surface of history smooths itself, as it always does. Yet small irregularities persist for those who know how to recognize them. In municipal records, properties once held by the vanished families resist reassignment, cycling through custodianships that expire without cause. In insurance databases, dormant clauses reactivate briefly when certain dates recur, then lapse again. Archivists report the sensation of returning to shelves where items have been removed so thoroughly that the absence itself feels indexed, as if a placeholder remains for something no longer permitted to exist. The pattern leaves behind a final echo in behavior rather than document. Families unrelated by blood but linked by sudden prosperity begin to exhibit the same early markers once recorded elsewhere. Advantages without explanation, resilience that outpaces context, transactions that close too cleanly. No contract surface, no seals are found. The mechanisms have refined themselves. What once required ink and wax now travels through structures already in place. Those who study these recurrences note a consistent temptation. Each generation believes it can benefit without inheriting consequence. That distance from origin equates to immunity. The earlier cases argue otherwise, not through warning but through precedent. The debt does not announce itself. It integrates. It waits. Somewhere, fragments continue to accumulate. A notation here, a gap there, margins that almost align. The danger is no longer that such ledgers exist, but that modern systems are designed to prevent their assembly. When records are complete enough to be trusted and incomplete enough to hide their seams, the conditions that allowed earlier bargains return under new names. The archives close for the night. Climate control hums. Lights dim. Nothing moves. And yet the sense remains, recorded only in private notes never filed, that something unfinished has simply learned to operate without being read.